People often called me a gentle and calm Omega. The kind noble families whispered about during tea gatherings and palace banquets. The kind who knew when to lower his eyes, how to speak softly, and how to seem refined without trying too hard. According to the endless chatter of ministers' wives and eager matchmakers, I was worthy of marrying a prince. That would have been flattering, if the compliments hadn't followed me around like an annoying little bird that refused to stop chirping. My name is Jian Wei. The fifth son of the Prime Minister, the king's right-hand man. That position sounds impressive, until you realize being the fifth son means 4 older brothers are already busy being successful and responsible. Meanwhile, I just had to exist quietly and marry well enough not to embarrass the family name. Naturally, I had done an excellent job at that. At least until that morning. I woke slowly, sunlight slipping through the carved wooden lattice of my window. The scent of plum blossoms drifted lazily into the room. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful and ordinary. Then the door burst open. "Young Fifth Master," my maid exclaimed breathlessly, nearly tripping over her own feet as she rushed inside, clutching a bundle of freshly pressed robes like a soldier running onto a battlefield. I blinked at her. It was far too early for this level of chaos. "What is it?" I asked, still half buried under my blanket, speaking with the calm dignity expected of a noble Omega who had been praised his entire life for being composed. She stared at me with wide, panicked eyes. "You must wake up immediately. Your husband-to-be will be arriving today. To see you." I stared at her. My brain refused to process those words. I sat up so quickly my blanket fell to the floor. "My husband-to-be," I repeated. She smiled brightly and said the words that nearly stopped my heart. "It is the Ghost General." Silence filled the room. The Ghost General. Out of every man in the kingdom. Out of every noble family, respectable scholar, decent merchant, or even a hard-working farmer who would have happily grown cabbages in peace, it had to be him. The man whose name alone made soldiers straighten their backs. The man who returned from battlefields so blood-soaked that people whispered spirits followed him home. And he was coming here. To see me. As his future spouse. I slowly covered my face with both hands. Then I jumped out of bed, threw on a robe, and marched out with the determination of someone about to challenge fate itself. It might have been foolish. But at the time, it felt reasonable. If there was anyone who could tell me exactly what was happening, that would be my mother. I found her in the inner courtyard, calmly overseeing breakfast preparations. The moment she saw my expression, she sighed the way mothers do when they realize their child is about to say something dramatic. "Mother," I said, bowing quickly before getting straight to the point. "I cannot marry the Ghost General." She did not even look surprised. Instead, she calmly lifted her teacup and took a small sip. "Why not?" "Because he's terrifying." She set her teacup down gently. "That is merely his reputation," she said. Then she explained that the marriage had been arranged by the Queen Mother herself. The Ghost General had agreed. My father had approved. "This marriage cannot be cancelled," she said. A long silence followed. I slowly sat down beside her, feeling the weight of my elegant reputation collapsing around my shoulders. All my life, people had praised me for being perfect. And apparently, being perfect had led me straight into the arms of the most terrifying alpha in the kingdom. I sighed heavily. Then an idea began to form. If the marriage could not be cancelled from my side, perhaps it could be ruined. What if the Ghost General decided he did not want to marry me? People thought I was the most gentle and refined Omega in the kingdom. But what if he discovered something different? What if he met an Omega who was clumsy, troublesome, rude, embarrassing, and completely unsuitable for a man with such a fearsome reputation. Surely even the ghost general would reconsider. I stood up, determination filling my chest. If the marriage could not be cancelled, then I would simply make him regret choosing me. I prepared myself to meet the most feared man in the kingdom. After all, if I annoyed him enough, surely even the ghost general would run away. People often said the ghost general looked like a man carved from ice. In battle, a ruthless alpha whose name alone could silence an entire court hall. A man who walked through wars as if death itself had chosen him as its favorite companion. And because of those terrifying rumors, I had imagined someone monstrous. Someone towering and brutal, with a face scarred beyond recognition. Someone whose presence would make the air feel heavy and dangerous. Unfortunately for my carefully planned rebellion, that was not the man who arrived at our residence. When the gates of our manor opened and Li Wuqian stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was not fear. Not brutality. Not even the intimidating aura everyone had described. But rather a quiet and terrifying elegance that made him look less like a battlefield monster and more like a dark prince who had simply wandered out of a war instead of a palace. He was tall. Far taller than any noble I had ever seen up close. Long black hair tied neatly behind him, sharp and composed features that somehow looked both cold and impossibly handsome at the same time. His dark robes were trimmed with subtle silver embroidery, while the faint shadow of battle seemed to cling to him like an invisible cloak. And when he walked into the courtyard, every servant immediately lowered their head, as if an emperor had just arrived. I watched him from behind the wooden screen of the corridor. And for one very dangerous moment, I forgot to breathe. So this was the man people feared across the kingdom. This was the terrifying ghost general. Why was he so handsome? I quickly slapped my own cheek. Focus, Jian Wei. This is not the time to admire enemy territory. I had a mission. My plan was simple, brilliant, and absolutely necessary. I needed to make him regret choosing me. If the marriage couldn't be cancelled from my side, then the ghost general himself would have to reject me. That was perfect. I straightened my robes and whispered to myself with determination. Stand on business, Jian Wei. Meanwhile, in the main hall, my father had already welcomed Li Wuqian with a level of respect usually reserved for royalty, personally escorting him inside while servants hurried around preparing a banquet so elaborate that one might think the emperor himself was coming for dinner. Large dishes soon covered the table. Steamed fish glazed in golden sauce. Fragrant bowls of rice. Roasted duck. Shredded meat delicately seasoned with spices. Several plates of vegetables arranged like works of art. The entire table looked less like a meal and more like a small festival. My father gestured politely. General Li, please sit. Li Wuqian nodded calmly. Prime Minister Jian, you are too kind. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to giving commands on a battlefield rather than attending family banquets. Servants poured tea. My mother smiled politely. Everyone behaved with the kind of careful elegance expected when entertaining a man who could probably conquer half the kingdom if he felt like it. Then the moment I stepped into the hall, Li Wuqian's gaze shifted toward me. Our eyes met. For a brief second, the room felt strangely quiet. And to my absolute shock, the terrifying ghost general gave me a small, gentle smile. My heart did something extremely embarrassing inside my chest. This was emotional manipulation. I immediately ignored him. Without even acknowledging his existence, I walked straight past him and casually dropped into the empty seat beside him, as if I were attending a normal family dinner and not meeting my terrifying future husband. The entire table froze. My father cleared his throat. Jian Wei. I pretended to focus on the dishes. My mother smiled tightly. "Fifth son," she said slowly, "you should greet generally properly." I reached for my chopsticks. "Fifth son," my father said, his voice tightening. "He is your future husband." I picked up a dumpling. My mother added gently, "He is your future husband." I chewed thoughtfully. "No, he's not." Silence exploded across the table. Even the servants stopped breathing. My father's eyebrow twitched dangerously. "What did you say?" "No," I replied calmly. Before anyone could react further, I leaned slightly toward Li Wuchen, reached over with my chopsticks, grabbed a slice of shredded meat directly from his chopsticks, and placed it into my mouth like someone who had completely forgotten what manners were. The entire hall froze. No one spoke. I slowly chewed. Across from me, my parents stared in absolute horror. Their perfectly raised Omega son had just stolen food from the Ghost General's chopsticks like a shameless bandit. My father looked ready to dig a grave for our family reputation. But the person I had truly been watching was Li Wuchen. I waited patiently for him to stand up and declare the marriage impossible. Instead, the Ghost General calmly picked up another piece of shredded meat. Then he gently placed it into the bowl in front of me. "Eat slowly," he said quietly. I blinked. This was not how my plan was supposed to go. I narrowed my eyes. Fine. If that didn't work, I would escalate. Without warning, I lifted one leg onto the chair, leaned over the table like a bandit who had just discovered treasure, grabbed an entire chicken leg, and began eating it with absolutely zero elegance. My mother's soul visibly left her body. "Jian Wei," she smacked my arm with her chopsticks. "Do you want to disgrace us?" The servants looked terrified. My father closed his eyes in silent despair. My mother quickly turned toward Li Wuchen with a deeply embarrassed expression. "General Li, please forgive him," she said hurriedly, bowing her head slightly. "This child has been spoiled since childhood, so he lacks proper manners." I continued chewing the chicken leg proudly. Across the table, Li Wuchen watched me quietly. Then he smiled. Not angrily. Not mockingly. Just calmly. He placed his chopsticks down and stood. "The wedding will be held in 3 days," he said. My chicken leg froze in midair. 3 days. He turned to my parents and bowed politely. "I will take my leave." Then the terrifying Ghost General of the Empire simply walked out of the hall, as calmly as he had arrived. The door closed. Silence filled the room. I slowly lowered the chicken leg and stared blankly at the doorway where Li Wuchen had just disappeared. My brilliant plan. My perfectly executed disgraceful behavior. Had completely failed. And in 3 days, I was going to marry the Ghost General. The day after the Ghost General visited our residence, the entire Jian household seemed to move around me as if I were some fragile object that might break at any moment. Servants whispering more quietly than usual. My mother watching me with a careful gaze. And my father pretending to read documents while occasionally glancing in my direction like a man silently praying his troublesome fifth son would not destroy the family reputation before the wedding even arrived. Unfortunately for them, that was exactly what I was planning to do. However, before I could begin my next brilliant act of rebellion, I discovered something far more frightening. Specifically, rumors about Li Wuchen. The Ghost General himself. It started while I was walking through the side courtyard that afternoon, lazily pretending to admire the lotus pond while secretly avoiding the etiquette instructor my mother had hired to prepare me for married life. I overheard 2 servants whispering near the garden wall with the kind of excited fear that only appears when people are discussing someone both terrifying and fascinating. They say the ghost general once fought an entire battalion alone, one of them murmured. That can't be true, the other replied nervously. It is true, the first insisted, lowering his voice further. My cousin serves in the Northern Army, and he said General Lee stood in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by enemies. And when the fighting ended, none of them were left standing. I slowed my steps. None? The second servant asked quietly. The wind rustled softly through the bamboo. And they say he barely sleeps, the first servant continued. He keeps his sword beside him even when resting. Soldiers who have served under him say when he enters the battlefield, his eyes look so cold, it feels like death itself has arrived. A small chill crawled down my spine. That is why people call him the Ghost General, the servant finished. I immediately turned around and walked away. Back in my room, I sat down slowly. So this was the man I was supposed to spend the rest of my life with. A battlefield ghost. A terrifying alpha whose enemies apparently disappeared like fallen leaves in winter. I swallowed. For a brief moment, I considered fainting dramatically and pretending to be ill for the next several months. Unfortunately, the wedding was already approaching, and my family would probably drag me to the ceremony even if I arrived unconscious. Which meant there was only one solution. If the Ghost General was truly as terrifying as the rumors suggested, then I needed to make him reject me before the wedding. With renewed determination, I immediately began my second plan. If I couldn't shock him with shameless behavior during the banquet, then I would become the most lazy, arrogant, and uncooperative Omega in the entire kingdom. The next morning, when my etiquette instructor arrived with scrolls, posture guides, and a very serious expression, prepared to teach me proper conduct as the wife of a powerful general, I simply rolled over on my bed and pretended to still be asleep. When she cleared her throat loudly, I ignored her. When she called my name, I buried my face deeper into the pillow. My mother herself came to check why the lesson had not begun. She found her supposedly elegant and gentle son lying across the bed like a lazy cat that had absolutely no intention of moving. "Jian Wei," she said slowly. I waved a hand lazily. "I'm tired." "You slept all night." "I'm still tired." The etiquette instructor looked horrified. My mother looked like she might personally throw me into the lotus pond. This pattern continued for the rest of the day. Whenever someone tried to teach me proper greetings, I forgot them. Whenever someone reminded me to sit properly, I slouched. Whenever someone told me to walk elegantly, I walked as if I had suddenly forgotten how legs worked. By evening, my mother's patience had completely evaporated. And somewhere between my dramatic laziness and my refusal to practice even the most basic manners, she finally reached the conclusion that something had to be done. That night, a letter was quietly sent from our residence. It was addressed to General Li Wuchen. Inside, my mother politely explained that her fifth son was being extremely uncooperative with all wedding preparations, and that she feared his stubborn behavior might cause embarrassment during the ceremony. It didn't bother me. Not until the next day. The day before the wedding began with a lot of noise. From the moment the sun rose, the front gates of the Jian residence became unusually busy. Servants hurried back and forth, guards moved large chests across the courtyard, and the sound of horses filled the morning air. Curious, I stepped outside. And immediately froze. Outside the gates stood a large convoy of carriages, each one carrying neatly stacked boxes tied with red silk ribbons, while soldiers wearing the insignia of the Northern Army stood beside them like silent statues. At the center of it all was a messenger. He bowed respectfully the moment he saw me. "These are gifts from General Li," he said calmly. Servants quickly began opening the boxes. Inside were treasures, expensive silks, beautiful jade ornaments, rare medicines, elegant jewelry, and even delicate hairpins crafted with incredible detail. The courtyard slowly filled with whispers of amazement. I stared at the gifts. The messenger bowed again. Generally asked that these be delivered to the fifth young master. Then he calmly added the message. The general also hopes the fifth young master will cooperate with the wedding preparations, so that neither family will fall into the displeasure of the royal court. Silence followed his words. Because everyone in the kingdom knew what that meant. This marriage had been arranged by the Queen Mother. If it failed, it would not simply be embarrassing. It could place both families under the royal blacklist. My father, the Prime Minister, could lose his position. Our entire household could suffer. The courtyard slowly emptied as servants carried the gifts inside, leaving me alone beneath the quiet morning sky. For a long moment, I simply stood there. Then I slowly sat down on the stone steps. My plan had been simple: embarrass the ghost general, make him reject me, and escape the marriage. But now, for the first time, I realized something I hadn't considered before. This marriage was not only about me. It was about my family. About my father, who had served the kingdom faithfully for years. About my mother, who had always protected me even when I caused trouble. If the wedding failed because of my stubbornness, they would be the ones to suffer. A quiet sigh escaped my lips. I looked at the silk ribbons tied around the gift boxes. Then I looked up at the sky. So that's how it is, I murmured softly. For the first time since this entire disaster began, I stopped trying to run away from it. Slowly, I stood. If marrying the ghost general would protect my family, then I would do it. Even if the man waiting for me was a terrifying alpha feared across the entire kingdom. Even if my future husband was the infamous ghost general, Li Wuchen. I straightened my robes. And for the first time since hearing about the marriage, I finally decided to accept it. The morning of my wedding arrived far sooner than I would have liked, bringing with it a strange mixture of quiet determination and nervous dread that settled heavily in my chest. Because although I had already decided the previous day that I would accept this marriage for the sake of my family, that decision did not magically erase the terrifying reality that by the end of this day, I would officially become the spouse of the most feared alpha in the entire kingdom. Naturally, my mother took the responsibility of preparing me for the ceremony with the seriousness of a general preparing a soldier for war. Servants filled my room before sunrise. Layer after layer of luxurious silk robes were carefully placed over my shoulders. The deep crimson fabric was embroidered with delicate golden patterns that shimmered under the soft morning light. My long hair was brushed, tied, and decorated with elegant ornaments that made me look far more noble and composed than I actually felt. When I finally stood in front of the mirror, even I had to pause for a moment. The reflection staring back at me looked stunning. Apparently, if one was going to marry the ghost general, one had to at least look impressive while doing so. Outside the manor, a luxurious wedding carriage had already arrived to escort me to the palace. The carriage itself was decorated with red silk ribbons and golden carvings that reflected the sunlight beautifully, while guards and attendants stood beside it with respectful expressions, making it very clear that this wedding was not just a family event but something the entire court was paying close attention to. My mother adjusted the collar of my robe one final time. "Behave yourself today," she whispered quietly. I nodded. For once, I truly intended to. The journey to the palace passed in a blur of nervous thoughts and racing heartbeats. And by the time the carriage finally arrived at the grand hall where the ceremony would be held, I realized that the wedding was far more elaborate than I had imagined. The hall was already filled with nobles, ministers, scholars, and officials. Their voices blended together into a low murmur of excitement and curiosity as they gathered to witness the marriage of the empire's most feared general. At the front of the hall, seated on an elevated throne with a calm but incredibly observant gaze, was the person responsible for this entire situation. The Queen Mother. Her presence alone made the atmosphere feel heavier, like the air itself was reminding everyone that this marriage carried the blessing and the expectations of the royal family. I lowered my gaze slightly. Today was absolutely not the day to try anything foolish. So for the first time since this whole situation began, I behaved exactly the way everyone expected me to. I stood calmly. I walked properly. I greeted the nobles politely. If anyone watching had known how disastrously I had behaved just days earlier, they probably would have fainted from shock. Then suddenly, the murmurs in the hall grew louder. Because the groom had arrived. When Li Wuchen stepped into the hall, the entire atmosphere shifted instantly. He was dressed in a magnificent wedding outfit of deep red silk embroidered with intricate golden dragons, the fabric flowing elegantly with every step he took. His long dark hair was tied neatly behind him with a gold crown ornament that reflected the light beautifully. For a moment, the terrifying ghost general did not look like a warrior who had conquered battlefields. He looked like something straight out of a fairy tale. A dark prince. Handsome, powerful, completely impossible to ignore. My eyes widened slightly before I quickly forced myself to look away. I refused to be mesmerized by him. That would be extremely embarrassing. But unfortunately for me, Li Wuchen had already noticed me standing there. His gaze softened. Then he walked toward me. And when he finally reached me, he gently took my hand. The contact was warm. Unexpectedly careful. "Come," he said quietly. My heart suddenly began beating far too fast. Together, we walked toward the front of the hall where the Queen Mother sat, watching everything with sharp interest. The entire room was silent as hundreds of eyes followed our movements across the polished floor. Unfortunately, the moment Li Wuchen held my hand, my body decided to betray me. My heartbeat grew louder. My palms felt warm. And despite the hall being pleasantly cool, I began to feel slightly nervous. By the time we reached the steps of the throne, I was quietly sweating. Which was deeply embarrassing, because Li Wuchen noticed. He glanced at me briefly, then without any hesitation, he reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small, clean face towel. Before I could even react, he gently lifted his hand and wiped the faint sweat from my forehead. The action was simple and careful. Almost affectionate. For a moment, the entire hall went silent. Then suddenly, the crowd exploded into excited whispers. "Did you see that? The ghost general helped his bride. I never thought he could be so gentle. Perhaps the rumors about him were exaggerated." Some nobles even laughed in pleasant surprise. Apparently, witnessing the terrifying ghost general behave like a considerate husband was the most shocking event of the year. Meanwhile, I stood there completely frozen. My face felt warm, and my heart was beating like a drum. Li Wuchen calmly returned the towel to his sleeve, as if he had done nothing unusual. Then the ceremony continued. We bowed respectfully before the Queen Mother. She gave her blessing with quiet dignity. And finally, the vows were spoken. The words echoed clearly through the grand hall, sealing the marriage under the watchful eyes of nobles, ministers, and the royal court itself. By the time the ceremony ended, a strange realization slowly settled in my chest. There was no more pretending. No more escape plans. No more ridiculous attempts to sabotage the wedding. Because now I was officially married. Jian Wei, the supposedly gentle Omega of the Prime Minister's household, had become the spouse of the infamous ghost general, Li Wuchen. When the wedding ceremony finally ended and the nobles began leaving the grand hall in lively discussion about the surprisingly gentle behavior of the infamous ghost general, the moment I had been avoiding all day quietly arrived. The moment I would officially leave my family home and follow my new husband to his residence. My father stood beside me with the calm composure of a man who had spent his entire life navigating the complicated world of the royal court, offering Li Wuchen a respectful nod that carried both gratitude and silent trust. My mother looked like she had just watched her only child being sent off to war. Tears formed in her eyes the moment she looked at me. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. I blinked. Then I sighed. Honestly, she was acting like I was leaving the kingdom forever. "Mother," I said patiently, "I will come visit soon." She sniffed. "I live in the same capital city." Her tears did not stop. I rubbed my temples. Why did everyone keep assuming the ghost general was going to eat me alive the moment we reached his house? Behind me, Li Wuchen stood quietly, giving my family enough time to say their farewells without interrupting. His calm presence somehow made the chaotic, emotional moment feel strangely stable. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. "I wish you a happy married life," he said, patting my shoulder. I took one last look at my parents. Then I turned and followed Li Wuchen outside. A magnificent black horse was waiting for us at the palace gates. Li Wuchen mounted the horse effortlessly, then extended his hand toward me. For a moment, I hesitated. But the entire palace courtyard was watching. So I took his hand. He lifted me up, easily settling me in front of him on the saddle as if I weighed absolutely nothing, which was both impressive and slightly humiliating. The moment the horse began moving, I suddenly became very aware of two things. First, Li Wuchen was very close. Second, my heart had once again decided to beat like a drum inside my chest. The steady rhythm of the horse's steps carried us through the capital streets while the wind brushed lightly against my face. And although the ride itself was calm and quiet, the awareness of Li Wuchen sitting directly behind me made the entire journey feel strangely intense. His arm occasionally moved slightly to guide the horse. Every time it did, my heartbeat sped up again. This was ridiculous. I had faced him during the wedding without fainting. Why was sitting on a horse suddenly more terrifying? Fortunately, the journey did not last long. Soon, the horse slowed to a stop. I looked up and immediately blinked in surprise. Before us stood an enormous residence surrounded by elegant stone walls and tall gates carved with intricate patterns. The entrance was decorated with tasteful lanterns and carefully arranged gardens that made the entire place look more like a noble estate than the home of a terrifying war general. This was not what I had imagined at all. In my mind, the ghost general's residence had been filled with dark corridors, ominous lanterns, and possibly a few ghost statues standing in corners just to maintain the frightening reputation. Instead, the place looked warm and welcoming. It almost felt like the home of a scholar rather than a man who had conquered battlefields. We dismounted from the horse. And the moment Li Wuchen stepped through the gates, rows of servants standing inside the courtyard immediately bowed respectfully. "Welcome home, General," they echoed loudly. Then their gazes shifted toward me. Their new master's spouse. One of the older servants smiled warmly. "May our master's home be filled with happiness and many children." The other servants nodded in agreement. I scoffed immediately. "Children? Let us slow down," I said dryly, crossing my arms slightly. "There will be no children for now." Several servants looked surprised. One of them quickly tried to hide a laugh. Li Wuchen said nothing, which somehow made the situation even more awkward. Before the conversation could become any stranger, a middle-aged female servant stepped forward with a respectful bow. "Young Master Jian," she said politely, "please follow me." I glanced at Li Wuchen. He simply nodded slightly. So I followed her through the residence. The interior of the mansion was just as impressive as the exterior, with wide corridors, elegant wooden screens, and softly glowing lanterns that created a calm and comfortable atmosphere. Eventually, the servant stopped in front of a door. "This will be your room," she explained. Slowly, I looked down the corridor, then back at the door, then at the servant. A small realization dawned on me. This room was completely separate from Li Wuchen's. For a moment, I stood there quietly. Then I stepped inside. The room was spacious and beautifully arranged, with soft bedding, polished wooden furniture, and a large window that allowed gentle evening light to fill the space. I looked around. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed. I had assumed the Ghost General would insist that we share a room immediately, which would have made this entire situation significantly more awkward. Instead, he had given me my own space. I leaned back slightly and exhaled. Maybe living with the Ghost General would not be as terrifying as I had imagined. At the very least, I could sleep peacefully in my own room. I didn't know what time it was when Li Wuchen left the mansion the next morning. Apparently, before leaving, the Ghost General had walked to my room, the servant said. He stood outside my door for a moment before gently pushing it open. I, however, knew absolutely nothing about it, because I was sleeping like someone who had no responsibilities in life. According to the servants, Li Wuchen stepped inside quietly and saw me sprawled across the bed in a very ungraceful position, my blanket half on the floor, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, as if I had lost a battle against my own mattress. He apparently stood there for a moment. Then he quietly pulled the blanket back over me. The Ghost General. The man feared across the entire kingdom. Tucked his newly married Omega into bed like a careless child. After that, he left. But before he rode out for his mission, he left instructions. Take care of him while I'm gone. That was what he told the servants. And then he left the mansion with his soldiers. When I finally woke up that morning, sunlight was already spilling through the window and hitting directly into my eyes. I groaned and buried my face into the pillow. After a few minutes of dramatic suffering, I slowly sat up and stretched. That was when I noticed a folded letter sitting neatly on the table beside my bed. I got out of bed and walked over to pick it up. The paper was thick and elegant. The handwriting was beautiful and neat. I unfolded the letter and began to read. The message was simple. He wrote that he had to leave early in the morning for a military mission and would return in a few days. He told me to eat properly, rest, and to stay safe while he was gone. That was it. No long explanations. No unnecessary words. Just a calm message written in neat, disciplined handwriting. I stared at the letter for a moment longer. Then I placed it back on the table. For some reason, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, though I quickly ignored it. Instead, I stretched again and muttered to myself, well, if he told me to eat properly, I guess I should listen. After all, it would be a waste to starve in such a huge mansion filled with food. Still, as I got ready for the day, my eyes drifted back to the letter on the table. I had married the most feared man in the kingdom. But somehow, that made the mansion feel a little less empty without him. 2 days passed quietly. After Li Wuchen left for his mission, the servants treated me with careful respect. The meals were always prepared on time, and the courtyard remained calm under the soft glow of the lanterns. Every night, I found myself looking toward the main gate whenever I walked through the courtyard, wondering if the Ghost General had returned. Which was ridiculous. I had spent weeks trying to escape this marriage. Yet now I was standing in his mansion, waiting for him, like some overly obedient spouse. So naturally, I pretended that wasn't what I was doing. On the evening of the second day, I was sitting near the courtyard pond, feeding crumbs to the fish, when the loud sound of horses suddenly echoed through the gates. My head immediately snapped up. The soldiers had returned. Servants quickly hurried toward the entrance as the large gates opened. And then I saw him. Li Wuchen rode into the courtyard with several soldiers behind him. His posture was still straight and dignified as always. But something immediately caught my attention. His right hand was wrapped in rough bandages. My brows immediately furrowed. What happened to his hand? The soldiers dismounted, and Li Wuchen stepped down from his horse. Even though his expression remained calm, I could clearly see faint traces of dried blood along the cloth wrapped around his hand. Before I even realized it, I was already walking toward him. "General," one of the servants said nervously, "your injury." "I'm fine," Li Wuchen replied calmly. That was not true. That bandage looked like someone had wrapped it while running away from a battlefield. I crossed my arms and stared at his hand. "That looks terrible." Li Wuchen looked at me, clearly surprised that I had approached him so quickly. "It's only a small injury." I raised an eyebrow. "If that's a small injury, I'd hate to see what you consider serious." Before he could argue, I grabbed his wrist. The servants gasped slightly. I ignored them. "Come with me," I said firmly. Li Wuchen didn't resist. In fact, he followed quietly. Inside the room, I sat him down and carefully unwrapped the bandage. The moment the cloth came off, I frowned. The wound was deeper than I expected. "Who wrapped this?" I muttered. "A soldier. Remind me to scold him later." Li Wuchen chuckled softly. I cleaned the wound carefully with warm water and herbs the servants brought. My movements were slow and careful so I wouldn't hurt him further. For a while, neither of us spoke. But I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I muttered. "You seem very concerned." I paused for a moment. Then I quickly looked away. "I just don't want people saying the ghost general died from a badly wrapped hand after marrying me." He laughed quietly. It was a warm sound. Once I finished treating the injury, I wrapped his hand again. This time properly. "There," I said. "Try not to fight another war tomorrow." "I'll try," he said quietly. From that night onward, something slowly changed between us. I started cooking sometimes. At first, the servants panicked when they saw me in the kitchen. But eventually, they accepted that I enjoyed preparing small meals for him. Whenever Li Wuchen returned from training or meetings, there would usually be something waiting for him. Soup. Steamed buns. Roasted meat. Sometimes I would sit beside him while he ate, pretending I wasn't watching him closely. And somehow, little by little, the distance between us disappeared. The mansion that once felt empty now felt warm. One evening, after handing him a bowl of soup, I leaned closer and quickly pressed a small kiss against his cheek before pulling away. Li Wuchen froze. I pretended nothing happened. But from the corner of my eye, I could see his ears turning slightly red. After that, it became a habit. A quick peck on his cheek when he returned. Another when he finished eating. Sometimes just because I felt like it. Somewhere along the way, without even realizing when it happened, I stopped thinking of this marriage as something forced upon me. Instead, I began to think of it as something I had chosen. Because the man everyone feared as the ghost general was actually the gentlest person I had ever met. And before I knew it, I had completely fallen in love with my husband. After a few more peaceful days, life in the ghost general's mansion had started to feel surprisingly normal. I cooked sometimes. He trained with his soldiers. And in the evenings, we would sit together under the lanterns while the night breeze carried the scent of flowers through the courtyard. If someone had told me weeks ago that I would willingly sit beside the feared ghost general while feeding him soup I made myself, I would have laughed in their face. Yet here I was, breathing the same air as him. One quiet morning, Li Wuchen suddenly said, "We should visit your parents." The idea made my heart jump slightly. Not because I didn't want to see them, but because the last time my parents saw me, I was practically plotting ways to escape this marriage. Soon, a luxurious carriage was prepared, and we rode together through the capital streets. Even though I had ridden beside Li Wuchen before, my heart still beat faster whenever we sat so close together. The man had an unfair ability to make my brain forget how to behave properly. Eventually, the carriage arrived in front of my family's mansion. The moment the servants announced our arrival, the entire courtyard became lively. My parents came out to greet us personally. The look on their faces when they saw Li Wuchen and I stepping down from the carriage together was priceless. My father tried to maintain his usual dignified composure, but the surprise was clearly written all over his face. My mother, however, looked like she might cry happy tears. "Jian Wei," she exclaimed softly as she hurried toward us. Before I could react, she grabbed my hand and squeezed it affectionately. "I'm so happy to see you both together like this." I awkwardly scratched the back of my head. "We're just visiting." But she was already smiling warmly at Li Wuchen. "I'm glad you two are getting closer." The servants quickly prepared a large banquet table inside the hall, just like they used to whenever important guests visited. Bowls of steaming dishes filled the long table within minutes. My mother clearly hadn't forgotten how much I liked food. We all sat down together, and the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. For once, no one looked like they were expecting me to start embarrassing the entire family again, which was probably a good thing. As the meal went on, my mother suddenly smiled mischievously. "You know," she said lightly, "if things continue like this, we might soon hear good news." I looked up from my bowl. "What good news?" She glanced between Li Wuchen and me with a bright smile. "Grandchildren, of course." I nearly choked on my food. My father coughed quietly into his sleeve, but my mother continued happily. "Your eldest brother already has 3 sons, she said proudly. And your second brother has twins, a boy and a girl." She looked at us expectantly. "So aside from your 2 other unmarried brothers, the next joyful news should come from you." Several servants nearby nodded eagerly. "We pray the young masters will soon hear the cries of a healthy child," one of them added happily. I slowly turned my head toward Li Wuchen. He was smiling. I rolled my eyes dramatically. "That is way too early," I said flatly. Everyone looked at me. I waved my chopsticks slightly. "We literally just started bonding." My mother laughed softly while the servants continued whispering hopeful blessings. Meanwhile, Li Wuchen simply sat there with that calm smile on his face, as if the idea didn't bother him at all. I narrowed my eyes at him. The ghost general might have conquered battlefields across the kingdom. But I had a feeling surviving my family's expectations might be his greatest challenge yet. Before we left my family's mansion, my mother insisted on giving us something. She returned with a beautifully sealed wine jar wrapped in red silk, the kind of wine that noble families usually kept for special occasions. "This is to celebrate your bonding," she said with a bright smile. The servants accompanying Li Wuchen accepted the gift respectfully, carefully placing it inside the carriage. My mother squeezed my hand one last time before we left. "Take good care of each other." I rolled my eyes a little at how emotional she sounded, but I still hugged her lightly. All right, I said. "I'll come visit again soon." My father gave Li Wuchen a respectful nod. Soon, we climbed back into the carriage. By the time we returned to the mansion, the sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the night sky calm and clear. Later that evening, Li Wuchen and I sat together in the courtyard. The lanterns glowed softly around us, and the moon hung quietly above the rooftops, casting silver light across the garden. It was one of those peaceful nights where the entire world seemed to slow down. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Li Wuchen finally broke the silence. "Jian Wei." I turned my head slightly. He looked at me calmly before asking the question. "Why were you so afraid of me at first?" I scoffed immediately. "You finally ask." He chuckled quietly. I leaned back slightly, folding my arms. "You're the most feared Alpha General in the entire territory," I said. "Of course people are afraid of you." I glanced at him. "Every story people told about you made you sound like some terrifying war demon." Li Wuchen raised an eyebrow. "War demon?" "Well, maybe not exactly those words," I admitted. "But the rumors were close enough." I sighed softly. "When I first heard that I was going to marry you, I was honestly terrified. The memory made me shake my head. That's why I tried to ruin the marriage at first." Li Wuchen listened quietly without interrupting. "When I was young," he said calmly, "my friends often mocked me." I blinked. "Mocked you?" He nodded slightly. "They said I was too soft." I stared at him. "I couldn't even hurt a fly," he said with a faint smile. The image of the feared ghost general being teased for being gentle was almost impossible to imagine. "But my father changed that," Li Wuchen continued. His voice was calm, but there was quiet respect in his tone. "He taught me that strength doesn't mean cruelty." I listened quietly. "He said a man must be strong enough to stand up and fight when the people he loves are in danger." The moonlight reflected softly in his eyes as he spoke. He looked at me again. "I may look cold and distant to others. But I am softer than people think." For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I smiled. Without thinking too much about it, I leaned closer and rested my head gently on his shoulder. "That's good," I said softly. Because somehow, hearing that made my chest feel warm. After that, Li Wuchen opened the wine my mother had given us. The rich scent filled the air as he poured it into 2 small cups. We drank together under the moonlight. At first, we spoke quietly. Then we laughed. And somehow, cup after cup, the wine began to make the night feel warm. Soon, I found myself giggling over things that probably weren't even funny. Li Wuchen wasn't much better, though he tried to stay composed. The slight curve of his smile told me the wine had gotten to him too. By the time the jar was nearly empty, the courtyard lantern seemed to sway slightly in my vision. "Jian Wei," Li Wuchen said softly. I looked at him. Though everything felt pleasantly blurry, the next thing I knew, he had lifted me into his arms. I laughed weakly. "I can walk." "You're drunk," he said calmly, and carried me inside anyway. The world felt warm and slow as he brought me into the bedroom. Then, as he gently set me down, I felt his hand brush my cheek. And before I could say anything else, his lips touched mine. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. The warmth of the wine. The quiet night. The gentle closeness between us. Everything seemed to blur together. And then something else happened. Something I had been trying to ignore for days. My body grew warm. Not the warmth of wine or embarrassment, but something deeper. Something that started in my chest and spread downward, settling low in my belly like embers catching flame. I pulled back slightly, my breath catching. Li Wuchen's eyes darkened. Jian Wei, he said again, his voice lower now. Your scent. I blinked. What? He paused, his jaw tightening. Your pheromones. I looked down at myself, suddenly aware of the faint sweetness that had begun to fill the air around me. My own scent. Usually light, barely noticeable. But now it was stronger. Sweeter. The unmistakable signal of an omega in the early stages of heat. Oh no. I had been so distracted by the wedding, by moving into the mansion, by learning to cook and banter with my terrifying husband, that I had completely forgotten to track my cycle. And now, on this particular night, with the wine warming my blood and Li Wuchen's hands still on my waist. My face burned. I started, but my voice came out breathier than I intended. Li Wuchen's grip on my waist tightened. His eyes were fixed on me, and I could see the restraint in them, the effort it was taking for him to keep still. You should go to your room, he said quietly. Before what? Before his control snapped. I should have gone. Every sensible thought in my head told me to get up, walk across the corridor, and lock myself in my own room until the heat passed. But the wine was still warm in my veins. And Li Wuchen was looking at me like I was something precious. And his scent, that deep, woodsy alpha scent, was wrapping around me like a blanket, making my head spin and my body ache for something I had never wanted before. No, I heard myself say. Li Wuchen went very still. What? I said no. I reached up and grabbed the front of his robes, pulling him closer. I'm not going to my room. Jian Wei. You're my husband. My voice came out steadier than I felt. This was always going to happen eventually. His eyes searched mine. Are you sure? You've been drinking. And your heat. I'm sure. I tugged at his robes again. Unless you don't want to. The question hung in the air between us. Then Li Wuchen made a sound low in his throat, something between a growl and a sigh, and kissed me again. This time, there was nothing gentle about it. His hands moved to the small of my back, pulling me flush against him. My fingers fumbled with the ties of his robes, clumsy from the wine and the heat and the sheer overwhelming want that had taken over my body. His scent intensified as his own pheromones responded to mine, deep and dark and protective, wrapping around me like a promise. You have no idea, he murmured against my lips, how long I've wanted this. Then stop talking, I breathed, and show me. He did. The rest of the night blurred into warmth and heat and the feeling of being completely surrounded by him. His hands. His lips. His voice in my ear, saying my name like a prayer. By the time morning light crept through the window, I was exhausted, sore, and more content than I had ever been in my life. Li Wuchen was still beside me, his arm wrapped around my waist, his face relaxed in sleep. I stared at him for a long moment. The ghost general. The most feared alpha in the kingdom. The man I had tried so desperately to escape. And now, he was mine. I smiled, closed my eyes, and fell back asleep. 3 weeks after that night, I began to notice something strange. At first, it was only fatigue. A slight dizziness when I stood too quickly. A heaviness in my body that made even simple movements feel slower than usual. I tried to ignore it. But Li Wuchen noticed before I did. He had been summoned away by the Queen Mother for an important military matter, leaving the mansion unusually quiet again. And I told myself I was fine. Until I wasn't. One morning, I collapsed back onto the bed after standing up. And that was when my mother arrived in a panic. She came rushing into the mansion the moment she heard I was unwell, my father right behind her with a physician in tow. "Jian Wei," my mother called immediately, taking my hand as I sat on the bed, trying to look less miserable than I felt. "I'm fine," I insisted weakly. But the physician stepped forward calmly. After a careful examination, the room fell silent. Then he spoke. "Young Master Jian is about 1 week pregnant." For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard correctly. "Excuse me?" The physician nodded again. "Congratulations." Then my mother gasped in pure joy. "I knew it," she almost shouted, grabbing my hand tightly. My father, though quieter, looked visibly relieved. But I just sat there frozen. Pregnant. That word repeated in my mind again and again. I slowly looked up. "Are you sure?" I asked the physician carefully again. He nodded without hesitation. And that was when something clicked in my memory. The night under the moonlight. The wine. Soft laughs. And a single moment where everything else faded away. I slowly turned my head toward my mother. "That wine," I said slowly. She smiled. I narrowed my eyes. "You said it was just a gift." "It was a bonding wine," she replied cheerfully. I stared at her. "You are full of surprises, mother." She only laughed softly, clearly not regretting anything. And somehow, despite everything, I couldn't even stay angry. A letter was immediately sent to Li Wuchen. And for the first time since I met him, I found myself waiting. 2 days later, he returned without delay. The moment he stepped into the mansion and saw me, his expression softened instantly. And when he heard the news, he was overjoyed. He simply walked toward me, took my hand, and spoke in a steady voice. "I will not leave again." I blinked. "Are you sure about that?" "What about the Queen Mother's assignment?" "She can wait," he said calmly. "I have to stay here and protect the ones I love." Something in my chest tightened at those words. From that day onward, Li Wuchen stayed by my side. Always close. Always watching over me. As the months passed, my body changed gently with time. And every morning, I would wake to find him either sitting nearby reading reports or quietly preparing food for me, despite having tons of servants. The ghost general of the empire had become something else entirely. Inside our home, he was a husband. A protector. And a man waiting for his family to grow. On the day our baby was born, the entire capital seemed to celebrate, as if the heavens themselves had blessed the empire. Drums echoed through the city. Lanterns filled the streets. Even the Queen Mother and the young king personally sent blessings and gifts, declaring the birth of our child a sign of great fortune for the kingdom. In my arms, I held a small baby boy. My husband, Li Wuchen, stood beside me, smiling brightly as he looked down at our child. I exhaled softly. "We have a family now." He nodded. "We named our baby Li Qingyu." It meant the one who carries forward the family's glory and shines brightly. My small, beautiful family was now complete. And for that, I was grateful. Extra A Jian Wei Li Wuchen story. The morning it happened, I was alone. Li Wuchen had left before dawn for a routine inspection along the northern border, a 3-day journey. He had assured me, nothing dangerous, just a formality. I had waved him off sleepily from the bed, still wrapped in his scent and the warmth of his side of the mattress. "The servants will take care of you," he had said, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Eat properly. Rest." "I always rest," I had mumbled. He had smiled, that soft, private smile he only gave me, and left. That was 6 hours ago. Now I was curled in the middle of our bed, gasping, as a wave of heat crashed through my body unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Let me explain something. As an Omega, I had experienced heats before. The predictable cycles, the mild fever, the aching need that could be managed with suppressants and a few days of isolation. Uncomfortable, yes. Inconvenient, absolutely. But never like this. This felt like my bones were on fire. I pressed my face into Li Wuchen's pillow, inhaling deeply. His scent was still there, dark wood, winter air, something uniquely him, and it helped. Barely. But it also made the ache worse, because he wasn't here. Damn it, I whispered, my voice trembling. The door creaked open. Young master. One of the servants hesitated at the threshold, her eyes widening as the wave of my pheromones hit her. Are you? Don't come closer, I said quickly. Get out. Close the door. She didn't need to be told twice. The door slammed shut. I heard her hurried footsteps retreating down the corridor, followed by the distant sound of panicked whispers. I buried my face in the pillow again and groaned. This was bad. This was really, really bad. 20 minutes later, a knock came at the door. Young Master Jian. The head servant's voice was careful, measured. We've sent word to General Li. He's been informed of your situation. I lifted my head weakly. How long until he returns? A pause. The messenger estimated, late tonight. Perhaps early tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. I closed my eyes. I couldn't do this alone until tomorrow morning. There's more, the servant continued hesitantly. The physician is here. He says your heat, it's accelerated. More intense than usual. He believes it's a reaction to, she hesitated. To the bonding. The bonding. That night, weeks ago, when Li Wuchen and I had finally. I swallowed hard. Of course. Our scents had entwined that night, deeper than either of us had realized. And now my body, recognizing him as my mate, was demanding his presence with an urgency that suppressants couldn't touch. Send the physician away, I said. There's nothing he can do. What about? Nothing, I repeated. Just, leave me alone. And don't let anyone else come near this wing of the mansion. Yes, young master. Her footsteps faded. And I was alone again. The hours that followed were a blur of heat and sweat and desperate, embarrassing need. I tried everything. Cold baths. Pressing my body against the cool stone floor. Drinking water until my stomach ached. Nothing helped. The heat came in waves, each one stronger than the last, and with each wave, the ache inside me grew sharper. I found myself crawling back to the bed, burying my face in Li Wuchen's pillow, breathing him in until my head spun. Where are you? I whispered into the fabric. The pillow didn't answer. I hated how much I needed him. I had spent weeks pretending I didn't want this marriage, pretending I wasn't falling for the terrifying ghost general with the gentle hands and the quiet smile. And now my own body was betraying me, laying bare every secret I had tried to keep hidden. I wanted him. Not just his scent or his presence or the way he looked at me like I was something precious. I wanted him. All of him. And the distance between us felt like a physical wound. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, the room was dark. And someone was saying my name. Jian Wei. A hand touched my forehead, cool against my burning skin. I leaned into it instinctively, a broken sound escaping my throat. Jian Wei, wake up. I forced my eyes open. Li Wuchen was kneeling beside the bed. His traveling cloak was still on, dusted with road dirt. His hair was loose around his shoulders, tangled from the wind. His eyes, those dark, calm eyes that everyone feared, were wide with something I had never seen there before. Fear. He was afraid. For me. You came back, I slurred. I rode through the night. His hand cupped my cheek, and I felt his pheromones flood the room, deep and protective, wrapping around me like armor. The servants said your heat accelerated, I finished weakly. Bonding reaction. It hurts, Li Wuchen. His jaw tightened. I know. I'm here now. He shrugged off his cloak and climbed onto the bed beside me, pulling me into his arms. The moment his body pressed against mine, the heat inside me seemed to crest, then slowly, begin to ease. I sagged against him, trembling. Better, he asked quietly. I nodded against his chest. Good. His arms tightened around me. I'm not leaving again. Not until this passes. You have duties. The duties can wait. His voice was firm, brooking no argument. You're my husband. You're my mate. Nothing is more important than you. I should have said something clever. Something sarcastic to hide how much his words affected me. Instead, I just clutched the front of his shirt and breathed. The heat lasted 3 more days. 3 days of fever and need and Li Wuchen's steady presence beside me. He held me through the worst of it, letting me cling to him, letting me press my face into his neck and breathe in his scent until my lungs ached. He brought me water when I was too weak to move. He fed me soup when I couldn't hold the spoon. He talked to me in that low, calm voice of his, telling me stories about the northern mountains, about the soldiers under his command, about anything and everything to keep my mind off the pain. And when the heat finally broke, when I lay exhausted and trembling in the sweaty sheets, he simply pulled me close and held me. Thank you, I whispered. For what? For coming back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pressed a kiss to the top of my head. I will always come back, he said. No matter what. Always. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in 3 days, I slept without dreaming. The morning after the heat ended, I woke to find Li Wuchen already awake, propped against the headboard with a stack of reports balanced on his knee. His hair was still loose, falling across his shoulders in dark waves, and he looked so unfairly handsome that I couldn't help but stare. You're staring, he said without looking up. I'm admiring, I corrected. There's a difference. He glanced at me, one corner of his mouth quirking up. Feeling better? I stretched experimentally. My muscles ached. My head felt foggy. But the heat was gone, completely, utterly gone, leaving behind only exhaustion and a strange sense of peace. Better, I admitted. Tired. Hungry. Embarrassed. Embarrassed? I pulled the blanket up to my chin. You saw me at my worst. Sweaty. Delirious. Begging, I cut myself off, my face burning. Let's not talk about what I said. Li Wuchen set down his reports and turned to face me fully. His expression was serious now, but his eyes were warm. You have nothing to be embarrassed about, he said. Heats are natural. And you, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. You were beautiful. You're lying. I never lie. I opened my mouth to argue, but he leaned down and kissed me, soft, gentle, unhurried. When he pulled back, I had forgotten what I was going to say. Stay in bed, he said. I'll have the servants bring breakfast. You're going to feed me again? If you want. I narrowed my eyes. You're spoiling me. Yes, he agreed simply. That's the point. He climbed out of bed and walked toward the door, still wearing nothing but his loose sleeping robes. I watched him go, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. Li Wuchen. He paused at the door. Yes. I hesitated. Then I said, I'm glad you're my husband. He turned back to look at me. The morning light fell across his face, softening the sharp lines of his features, and for a moment, he didn't look like the ghost general at all. He just looked like mine. I'm glad you're my husband too, he said quietly. Then he left to get breakfast. And I lay back against the pillows, smiling like an idiot, already counting the minutes until he returned. The end.